October 2nd, 2019, 11:45 post-meridium Rivne. 11:45 post-meridium Rivne. 24-year-old Yuliya was walking along Soborna Street and talking on the phone with her friend. At some point, the girl noticed that she was being followed by an unknown person, and just a few minutes later, he attacked Yuliya, covering her mouth and started to strangle her. Soon, the girl lost consciousness, and when she came to, she recognized her neighbor as the attacker. It was he who 10 years ago on this very same date committed an assault and murdered a local girl who was still 7 years away from adulthood. That evening, the 102 emergency service in Rivne received a call. It was Yuliya's friend who called, telling them that she had just spoken with her on the phone. During the conversation, Yuliya complained to her friend about an unknown man who was following her. And soon after that, strange sounds and crackling were heard on the phone. Then everything went silent. Dear friends, before writing the script for this episode, we talked to the victims of the attacker we are going to discuss. They agreed to share many details related to the case, so the story will be based on their words. Please note that this story needs wide publicity because the so-called hero of today's episode will be out very soon. Maybe released. So, the story begins back on October 2nd, 2009. On that day, 11-year-old Kateryna asked her parents to let her go for a walk in her yard. The clock showed about 5 or 6 in the evening, but it was still light outside. Kateryna's family lived in the Yuliya neighborhood, which was considered, and in fact is still considered, a very quiet and peaceful place. Directly on the street where Katya's house was located, the neighbors knew each other well. They had all lived there for a long time and were friends with each other, so when the girl told her parents about her desire to go for a walk not far from home, her family had no fear for her, and they easily let the girl go for a walk. However, when it started to get dark outside and Katya's parents began calling her home, she did not respond. The girl also did not answer numerous phone calls, and it is quite logical that this caused concern among her relatives. Trying to find the child, they called all of the girl's friends and acquaintances. But none of them could answer the question about where she had actually gone. And even though Katya's parents were already very worried about her, very much so, they still had a small hope that the girl had gone to visit her aunt, who lived not far from their street. But when they contacted the woman, she said that Katya was not with her, and she wasn't. After learning about this, now truly frightened, the parents began to walk around all the neighboring streets and yards, hoping to find the missing child there. This took several hours, but unfortunately these actions did not bring any results. Then the family realized that they could not cope on their own, and around midnight, Kateryna's father went to the local police station, where he filed a report about his daughter's disappearance. Meanwhile, Kateryna's mother and older sister continued searching for her on their own. Katya's mother was so desperate that she did everything she could. She even turned to a folk healer for help, but the healer didn't say anything specific. That night, her family wandered the city streets and searched for the child on their own. And in the morning, around 8 o'clock, a large investigative and operational group arrived in the area along with service dogs. While some of the law enforcement officers, together with the dogs, tried to pick up, so to speak, Kateryna's trail, another group of police officers was taking statements from relatives and neighbors. Hours later, a female police officer, who was also a relative, came to Kateryna's family. At that moment, Kateryna's mother, due to her daughter's disappearance, was, to put it mildly, in a very distressed state. The policewoman didn't bother her needlessly. She took Irina, the missing girl's older sister, aside instead. The woman told her that in the basement of an unfinished building located near their house, the police had found the body of a girl. The policewoman could not say for sure that this body belonged to Kateryna, and in order to confirm this, she began to describe to her sister the clothes the girl was wearing, as well as the items found with her.
I couldn't believe it was her until they described one thing to me. She had a hairpin in her hair. It was my hairpin. I had to hold back my emotions then because my mom was unaware of what had happened, and I couldn't tell her. My father also couldn't find the strength to tell her, even though by that time he already knew that the police had found a girl who looked very much like Katya.
The next day after the girl's body was found, Kateryna's father went to identify the body. Then the information that it belonged to Kateryna was officially confirmed and publicly announced. Law enforcement officers immediately began to consider the version according to which Kateryna became the victim of a brutal crime. There were more than enough grounds for such a conclusion. First of all, they tried to hide the girl's body. Before leaving, the killer covered the body with blankets. Signs of violence were found on the victim. The entire body was covered with bruises and hematomas. And as noted by the pathologist who conducted the examination, Rostem, in all his career, he had never seen such abuse of a child. Trying to identify the person involved in the murder, the police asked all the boys and men from the area where the deceased lived to come in for questioning. The police focused specifically on males because, in addition to the injuries, there were also signs on the victim's body indicating that Kateryna had been the victim of rape. During the interrogations, all the local men and boys were asked about their alibis. But when it was 16-year-old Roman Mikloszewski's turn, he practically confessed right away that he was the killer. What's more, the boy pointed out to the police the places where he had hidden Kateryna's personal belongings. He also described the crime in detail, mentioning specifics that, well, simply no one but the killer could have known. That same day, an investigative experiment was conducted during which Roman reenacted all his actions that preceded and accompanied the crime. Meanwhile, the news that law enforcement had identified the killer had already reached the locals. They were all shocked by the fact that the criminal turned out to be a young and quiet boy who, by the way, had lived his whole life in the same building as Kateryna and had actually watched her grow up before his eyes. According to Irina, the sister of the deceased, she had known Roman since childhood. He had always seemed a bit strange to her. He rarely socialized or played outside with peers. He was withdrawn and uncommunicative. But despite this, he never showed any aggression. None of his neighbors could have even imagined that he would be capable of something so terrible. You see, Mikloszewski himself came from a religious family. His mother traded at the local market. Neighbors often came to her to shop. So, the woman, in contrast to her son, was very communicative and maintained friendly relations with the neighbors. Kateryna's mother had a daughter, Roman's sister, who was good at climbing trees as a child. The girls were even friends for some time, you know. Already after the law enforcement officers detained Mikloszewski, his mother began spreading among the neighbors versions that her son was not guilty of anything. She assured everyone that it was the cops who forced the boy to confess to everything under pressure. She stated that her Roman was not capable of such a brutal murder. She insisted that her son was probably just covering for someone and agreed to take all the blame on himself. But someone else's guilt. Why? Because he was paid for it, according to her words. But several important facts contradicted all these stories. As previously mentioned, Roman hesitantly showed law enforcement the locations where he had concealed the victim's belongings, but not right after his confession. Among them was her phone, from which he had previously removed the subscriber identity module card. The boy buried the phone and the card in completely different places, and he himself pointed out where. Previously, Katerynka wore a pendant gifted by her father, which the boy also hid in the yard. These items were discovered in various locations, based on the testimonies provided by Mikloszewski and others. It was extremely difficult to come across them by accident. Moreover, under the girl's fingernails, traces of biological material were found, which belonged, guess who, Mr. Mikloszewski. In addition, one of the neighbors said that he saw the girl the day before her disappearance walking together with Roman toward that same unfinished building where her body would later be found. Several witnesses also appeared on Mikloszewski's side. It was a group of boys who, let's say, abused alcoholic beverages and from time to time drank them together with Roman. At the trial, which took place later, they tried to convince everyone that Mikloszewski was spending time with them at the moment of the murder, as he usually did. But eventually the boys got confused in their own testimonies, so their version of events was ultimately not taken into account at the trial. After being detained, Mikloszewski quickly changed his initial testimony. He, let's say, adjusted them so that they matched the stories his mother was spreading. He started denying his guilt in court. Here are quotes from the protocol.
The defendant did not plead guilty to the crimes committed. He testified that he did not commit the crimes he was charged with. The testimony in which he confessed to committing the crime was given under duress from police officers.
The consideration of this case lasted for about 2 years. In 2011, when Miklaszewski turned 18, he finally heard his sentence. He was found guilty and sentenced to 14 years in prison. However, later Roman's lawyers filed an appeal and his sentence was reduced to 12 years. An important factor in the case is that Miklaszewski was only charged with murder and he was given a few more years for stealing a phone. That is, Roman was never charged with raping the girl. It's hard to say why things turned out this way. Katerynka's relatives claimed that the girl was abused in an unnatural way without penetration by a sexual organ. Because of this, it was not possible to find any biological samples on her body, and therefore it was impossible to prove the facts of the abuse. But even despite this, Kateryna's family was partially satisfied with the sentence that Roman received. After talking to the lawyers, the girl's parents and sister tried to look at things objectively. That is, they understood that the boy would not receive a life sentence, but his isolation from society for 12 years at least somewhat, though only a little, brought them some relief. Moreover, the deceased's relatives believed in a widely accepted view. Well, about the fact that behind bars, with criminals who commit such crimes, especially against children, unpleasant things are done to them. So, Kateryna's family did not rule out the possibility that the guy might not even survive, let's say, until the end of his sentence. However, you see, everything turned out differently. Roman Miklaszewski, while behind bars, filed an appeal every year, trying to reduce his sentence. In their petitions, the lawyers referred to the exemplary behavior of the guy in the colony. And finally, one of these appeals was granted. And after 9 years and 6 months, Mr. Miklaszewski was released under the Savchenko law. So now, not a 16-year-old boy, but a 26-year-old man returned home. He simply returned to his apartment, located in the neighborhood where he once killed Kateryna. For all these years, the local residents, hearing versions about Roman's innocence, which I remind you, were spread by his mother, began to question things. But what if he really is innocent? That could actually be the case, and this thought took root in the minds of many residents. So at the moment when Roman was released, basically no one perceived the news of his release as something bad. When he returned to their street, the townspeople, although they treated him with caution, however, they didn't pay much attention to him, they just continued living their own lives. Kateryna's relatives found out that Miklaszewski was free purely by accident. After the trial ended, they could no longer live in their apartment. So they didn't sell it right away and moved to a completely different district. Later, Kateryna's family learned about Miklaszewski's release from their former neighbor. Irina and her parents, of course, were shocked by this news, but they couldn't do anything about it. It was the court's decision before the meeting, so they decided to simply forget about Miklaszewski forever. However, Kateryna's relatives won't be able to do this because very soon everyone in the village will be talking about Roman Miklaszewski again. The reason for this will be that on the 10th anniversary of Katya's murder, the man will commit another terrible attack, thus finally proving that all the rumors about his innocence were a lie. October 2nd, 2019. 24-year-old Yuliya was walking with her friend. By the time the girls decided to go their separate ways, night had fallen. Yuliya intended to stay the night at a different friend's house. Evening was already turning into night, but it was still very warm outside. The weather was really nice, so the girl decided not to call a taxi, but to walk instead. On the way, Yuliya called her friend, with whom she actually planned to spend the night. Throughout the entire walk, the girls talked about various topics. They even remembered a gruesome crime that happened in their neighborhood 10 years ago. Exactly 10 years ago, they talked about the fact that Miklaszewski was recently released and wondered whether he was really guilty of the crime. Yuliya was just 14 when Katerynka was killed. Despite this, she remembered well the gruesome events of those days. The body found in the unfinished building, Miklaszewski's confession, the investigative experiment, and finally the funeral of the little girl, which was attended by many local residents. These memories were forever engraved in Yulina's memory. However, like most of the district's residents, the girl did not know all the circumstances of the case. The rumors spread by Miklaszewski's mother also reached Yuliya, so by the time Roman was released from prison, she did not dare to state for sure that he was Kateryna's killer. So, while walking and talking with her friend, the girl at some point noticed a man in a hood. It seemed to her that he was following her. However, at first Yuliya did not pay much attention to it. There were still many passers-by on the street, cars were driving by, and her friend was on the line. So, There didn't seem to be any real danger, but the further Yuliya walked, the more the stranger unsettled her. To make sure she was really being followed, the girl slowed her pace and then stopped altogether near some trash containers. She tried to get a better look at the stranger, but she couldn't manage to do it. Meanwhile, the man sped up, and at first this frightened Yuliya. But soon she sighed with relief, as she realized that he had stopped by the dumpsters and, judging by everything, started to relieve himself there. Then he came out from there and actually went in the opposite direction from Yuliya, so she concluded that there was no danger from that man. She went on. However, now from time to time she looked around in all directions. The girl told her friend about this situation. She said that she had really worked herself up, and they even laughed about it. They laughed, and that was good, but her friend still said that she could go out and meet Yuliya.
Her friend says, "Let me come out. I'll come down to you." But knowing that she has a small child sleeping at home, I didn't want her to wake the child or, even more so, leave the child alone. It seemed to me that the danger had passed, everything seemed to be fine, so I persuaded her not to come out. And it was at that moment that I noticed that all the pedestrians and cars seemed to have suddenly disappeared from the street.
The girl kept walking, constantly looking around. She didn't see any danger around her. And against this background, at some point she relaxed and lost her vigilance. When Yuliya approached the place, you can see in the photo she heard two muffled footsteps behind her. And then she felt someone's hands on her neck and face. In the first seconds, the thought flashed through Yuliya's mind that this was some kind of bad joke, a very bad joke by someone she knew. But soon she felt the hand on her neck squeezing tighter and cutting off her airway. Despite the fact that Yuliya felt she was about to lose consciousness, she still kept squeezing the phone in her hand. And on the other end of the line, the girl's friend heard strange sounds and realized that something was wrong, that this was not normal. At the same time, the attacker tried to kick the phone out of his victim's hands, but with her last bit of strength, she lifted it high up and tried to remove the stranger's hands from herself with her other hand. However, their strength was unequal. Minutes later, Yuliya lost consciousness and fell into darkness. Behind the bus stop, which you can now see in the photo, if you can't see it, just look at the screen, there is an approximately 7-meter slope. It is quite steep and leads to the roofs of a garage cooperative. Yuliya ended up here, lying in the middle of this slope with her head toward the bus stop and her feet toward the garage roofs. The first thing the girl saw when she opened her eyes was her phone and the same man who had recently been following her. He was just sitting next to the girl and doing nothing. Now Yuliya had the chance to take a good look at him. The girl quickly recognized her attacker as her neighbor, Mr. Roman Miklaszewski. She immediately remembered the crime the man had been accused of back in 2009. Realizing who her pursuer was, Yuliya finally became convinced that all these years, the rumors about Miklaszewski's innocence were just rumors. Now the fact that he is a murderer became obvious to her. And then Yuliya thought that her chances of surviving this night were not that high.
When I came to my senses, my phone was lying next to me. At first I couldn't understand what was happening. He was standing to the side near me at that time and wasn't doing anything. He was just waiting for me to come to my senses. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Who doesn't know what he was doing during that time? However, I was dressed. No sexual acts had occurred at that point. He was just waiting for me to wake up, and it was only after I woke up that he continued his assault.
Seeing that the girl had regained consciousness, Miklaszewski sat on her and tried to undress her. Yuliya began to resist. A struggle broke out between her and the attacker. When Roman realized that his victim was not ready to give up so easily, he began to strangle her again, saying the following:
"You will die today. This is your last day."
Yuliya soon lost consciousness again. Upon waking, the scene was unchanged from before. Roman just sat and waited for her to open her eyes. He attacked only when he saw that she was conscious. As the victim recalls, she lost consciousness in a similar way 3 times. The next time, when she regained consciousness, she realized that she no longer had the strength to fight off Miklaszewski. So she stopped resisting and decided to try to talk to him. Yuliya remembered seeing similar techniques in movies and thought that this might be her chance to escape. Roman, realizing that the girl had stopped resisting, pulled down the lower part of her clothes and tried to rape her. But something, let's say, didn't work. Then the girl, trying to lull Miklaszewski's vigilance, began to calm him down. She tried to assure Roman that everything was fine, that he didn't need to attack her because she considered him very cool, and if he had just approached her and suggested getting to know each other better, she would have gladly agreed. It is worth mentioning here that Roman and Yuliya had already known each other before, although in reality they were never friends, and their communication was limited to a simple hello-hi. But still, they were almost the same age, had lived their whole lives in the same yard, and in her teenage years, Yuliya was even in the same group with Roman's sister. And even though the man knew his victim well, her words did not really have much effect on him. He continued to threaten her, and at some point he said,
"I'll finish with you now. You'll stay here, and I'll go for a walk."
Although Yuliya was scared, she still decided not to give up. She hoped that her tactic might still work. The girl asked the attacker where he planned to go and asked him to take her with him. However, Roman replied no to this. And again he emphasized that Yuliya would stay here forever. Overall, during the attack, he repeatedly said that the girl would not be able to get out of this situation alive. At the start of the attack, one of Yuliya's sneakers flew off her foot. At some point, realizing that she might have to run away, she asked Roman to give her the shoe, saying that her feet were very cold. And Roman, after hearing this request, said that the girl didn't need the sneaker. And he asked her not to worry about the shoes, because in the morning, law enforcement would find both her shoes and her. Theoretically, maybe he meant something else. But most likely, he meant that Yuliya would be found as a murder victim. While the girl was trying to talk to Roman, her friend with whom she had communicated the day before the attack raised the alarm. The girl called the police and informed them about the situation that had developed. The friend had an approximate idea about the place where Yuliya was before she actually lost contact with her, so she asked the patrol to go specifically in that direction. While waiting for help from law enforcement, the girl repeatedly tried to call Yuliya. As I already said, when Yuliya came to, she saw her phone next to her. She believes that when she lost consciousness and Roman dragged her to the slope, her phone fell out of her hands. However, Miklashevsky went back for it and placed it near the girl. Why did he do that? Good question. The girl is convinced that the criminal remembered well that in the previous case of Katya's phone theft he received an additional sentence, so this time he decided to correct the mistakes he made during the first crime. So the girl's phone was ringing non-stop and constantly vibrating. At some point this started to really annoy Roman and he asked Yuliya,
"Who's that? Is your admirer calling?"
The girl tried to convince her suitor that it was her mother calling, who was worried about her daughter. At that moment, Roman still didn't get an erection, but the girl had already managed to distract his attention a bit from trying to hurt her by talking to him. At some point, he trusted Yuliya so much that he asked her to change positions and told her to sit on his stomach. She did so. Now she and Miklashevsky had switched places, so she could see what was happening at the bus stop. Roman still wasn't succeeding at anything. Yuliya continued talking to him, and after a while, she saw a police car approaching them. The law enforcement officers stopped near the attack scene but didn't rush to exit the vehicle and investigate. Yuliya realized that this was her only chance, because without outside help she couldn't escape from Miklashevsky. But in fact there was nowhere to run. The only thing the girl could do was somehow try to get as close as possible to the police car. Yuliya's phone meanwhile kept ringing non-stop, and the girl told Roman that her mother was very worried. She asked the attacker to let her talk to her. She said that her mother had her geolocation, so if she wasn't reassured, she might come to them right now, and let's say ruin the moment. Surprisingly, the attacker agreed to this, and Yuliya answered the call. On the other end of the line was Yuliya's friend. The girl, realizing she needed to be clever, turned the phone volume down and pretended to talk to her mom. She kept repeating that she was fine, and at that moment realized that since they were on a slope, she could pretend there was a bad connection here. So Yuliya started repeating her words as if she could barely be heard. Simultaneously, she gradually rose and moved in a specific direction, feigning an attempt to catch a signal. Miklashevsky noticed this, tensed up a bit, but still didn't do anything. The girl whispered, asking him to be quiet, and kept backing away herself. She took a few steps, moving toward the path that was uphill. Seeing that Roman didn't react to this, Yuliya took a few more steps. At that moment, the attacker turned his head and realized that the girl was running away, while she quickly started climbing uphill, pulling up her lowered underwear and leggings as she went. Just a few seconds later, exhausted, beaten, and disheveled, the girl knocked on the window of a police car and pointed the officers in the direction where Miklaszewski was. The police officers ran after him, but Roman was no longer there. He knew the area and escape routes well since he grew up in this neighborhood. Realizing Yuliya had escaped, he likely climbed down onto a garage roof and fled through the streets from the attack scene. Yuliya was waiting for the police to return in their car. When they arrived and started questioning the girl about what had happened to her, she was still in a state of shock. In the end, she managed to compose herself. The girl told them everything she knew about her attacker because she wanted him to be found as soon as possible. Yuliya found Roman's page on Instagram and showed it to the police. Then they drove around several streets with law enforcement officers, attempting to locate the criminal. However, this was unsuccessful. Then law enforcement and Yuliya visited Miklaszewski's apartment. Roman's mother met them at the doorstep. She saw bruises on the girl's body and began to ask what had happened to her. When she was told about the incident, the woman refused to believe what she heard and said that her son simply wasn't at home and he had nothing to do with it. The law enforcement officers did not have a search warrant and were forced to leave the apartment. Together with Yuliya, they went to the station where the girl's statement was taken. Very soon, a wanted notice was issued for Roman Miklaszewski. Not only law enforcement officers but also many local residents joined the search. Volunteers combed almost the entire city. Yuliya is still very grateful to each of them, to the caring people who were concerned about her situation and helped in the search for the attacker. While nearly the whole city searched for Roman, Yuliya testified at the station. She was also asked to cut her nails so that they could be analyzed. The girl herself, during the struggle with the attacker, tried to scratch him. She realized that she might not survive this night and thought that if that happened, at least the criminal could be found if enough of his biological material remained under her nails to point investigators to Miklaszewski. On the attack night, Yuliya didn't dare stay at her neighborhood place, opting for her friend's house instead. In addition, she asked the police to assign a patrol to watch over the building and the yard where Roman lived. She was convinced that the man had nowhere to hide, so he would definitely return home. But the request remained unanswered. Let's say the law enforcement officers ignored it. The next morning, Yuliya had to go to the police again. As she prepared to leave for the station, Miklaszewski's mother called her. The woman asked the girl to withdraw her statement and offered any amount of money for it. Yuliya, as you understand, refused, and then Roman's mother resorted to manipulation. She claimed that if her son was imprisoned again, she would lose any reason to go on living. All this was said to make Yuliya feel pity and guilt. When that didn't work, Roman's mother asked Yuliya to talk to him. The man quickly apologized, explaining he didn't recognize Yuliya as his neighbor. Yuliya was greatly shocked by these words. Whether he recognized her or not, it's clear that you can't beat, strangle, or attempt to rape anyone. Despite everything else, Roman also told Yuliya about how bad it was for him in prison. He, just like his mother, asked the girl to withdraw her testimony and not ruin his life. Poor guy. This whole conversation was pointless. It made no sense at all. However, thanks to this conversation, Yuliya realized that Roman was at home. As it turned out, it wasn't that important. After all, when the girl arrived at the police station a few hours later, Roman Miklaszewski was already there with his lawyer. By the way, the man enlisted the support of a rather professional defender who has a lot of experience winning cases. How Roman managed to do this and where he got the money for a professional, Yuliya doesn't know. According to her, Miklaszewski does not come from a wealthy family. His family always lived, well, simply, maybe even a bit worse than most of Yuliya's acquaintances. Once at the station, Miklaszewski immediately began to deny all the accusations made against him. He said that he wasn't at the scene of the crime at all. He stuck to this version until the results of the examination came in. According to them, traces of DNA belonging to Miklaszewski were found on Yuliya's body and under her fingernails. Only then did Roman partially agree to admit his guilt. However, he stated that he had no intention of killing Yuliya. After the confession, the men underwent a psychiatric examination at an independent center. But it turned out that at the time of the attack, Roman was acting completely consciously. He was not in a state of affect, was sober, and was not under the influence of psychotropic substances. He could influence and change the course of his actions. The man was not found to have any mental illnesses, only noted to have problems with aggression, and he flares up very quickly. Based on this examination, Miklaszewski was found to be sane. However, the trial in court dragged on for several long years. Yuliya enlisted the support of a professional lawyer and attended every court session. It was hard for her to see Miklaszewski every time and to recall the attack, but she understood perfectly well that the case had to be brought to an end because otherwise new victims might soon appear in the city. Despite the danger that Roman poses to society, the sentence he received in December 2024 turned out to be, to put it mildly, disappointing. The man was convicted but only to 3 years and 4 months of imprisonment. Miklaszewski had served his entire term in pre-trial detention by then, so he was due for release. Such a short sentence for the crime was due to the fact that, under one of the articles regarding minor bodily injuries inflicted on Yuliya, the statute of limitations had expired and it simply was not included in the verdict. In addition, the previous case involving Kateryna was not taken into account at all. Since in 2009 it was not possible to prove that Kateryna had been raped, the attack and attempted rape of Yuliya could not be considered a repeat offense. Even though the court acknowledged the fact that Roman did not follow through, meaning he did not rape Yuliya. Not by choice, only for reasons he couldn't control, so to speak. So this also did not affect the man's sentence in any way. The court only considered that Miklaszewski, after serving his initial sentence, failed to reform while incarcerated. Yuliya, who was sure that Roman would be sentenced to at least 12 years, saw this verdict as a mockery of the judicial system towards her, as well as towards other victims of similar crimes. When she heard that Roman could simply be released now, it felt as if something inside the girl was torn apart. At some point she almost gave up, but she still found the strength within herself to keep fighting for justice. So Yuliya decided to appeal the initial court decision and filed an appeal. In fact, very soon on April 14th, 2026, her case will be heard in court. The girl is ready to go all the way. She understands that if she loses the appeal, Romano will be released right from the courtroom. He will be able to attack anyone again. That's why Yuliya decided that if she loses, she will still continue to fight and appeal to the Supreme Court. Currently, in the district where Miklaszewski lived, there are no people left, those who believe in his innocence. Everyone is very scared of his possible release from prison. The only exception is probably his mother, well, and also the lawyer. In a conversation with journalists, the defender stated that he does not consider his client to be as dangerous to society as he is portrayed. So, he is dangerous, but not that much. Hearing these words, Yuliya asked a logical question, quite a logical one. If a man who kills a child who grew up before his eyes and then commits a repeated attack is not considered a threat, then who can be considered dangerous at all? Yuliya still continues to live with the consequences of the attack on her. She feels bad both physically and psychologically. Because Roman strangled her during the attack, the girl systematically develops problems with her vocal cords, and every minor illness ends up with her losing her voice. In addition, when the girl realized after the attack that someone had tried to kill her, she began to experience panic attacks. Yuliya tried to cope with them with the help of a psychologist, but it did not give her the desired result. Then she realized that it was time to see a psychiatrist. Diagnosis: severe post-traumatic syndrome with depressive state and panic attacks. Yuliya says that she was very lucky with her doctor, who was deeply moved by her story and supported the girl. Yuliya also wants to emphasize that people who feel or experience something similar must definitely seek medical help. Don't be afraid to take medication or antidepressants under a psychiatrist's supervision, because these are truly effective means that helped Yuliya out of an extremely difficult condition. I agree, I experienced the same after having cancer. I would also add that despite the horror of this story, it brought Yuliya much closer to Irina, the sister of Kateryna, Roman's first victim. The women started communicating after the attack on Yuliya was reported in the press. Now they are trying to support each other and together continue to fight for Miklaszewski to receive the fair sentence he deserves. As always, please take care of yourselves, your family, and your loved ones. And we'll see each other in the next video.